In January 1944, deep in the Apennine mountains of Italy, an Allied infantry platoon realized something was terribly wrong. Snow had erased the narrow roads marked on their maps, and weeks of shelling had turned mountain paths into broken scars of rock and ice. Radios crackled with static, then went silent. Supply trucks failed to arrive. The platoon was not surrounded by enemy troops, but it was isolated in a way that felt just as dangerous. In this terrain, isolation meant exposure, exhaustion, and slow disappearance. The Italian campaign had already proven to Allied commanders that technology alone could not solve every problem. Tanks stalled on steep slopes. Vehicles slid off mountain roads. Aircraft were grounded by weather for days at a time. In response, the U.S. Fifth Army quietly expanded the use of pack animals, horses, and mules assigned to mountain and logistics units. Official field reports described them plainly, without drama. Yet for soldiers stranded in the mountains, these animals represented something far more significant. A final connection to survival. The platoon's commanding officer, whose name appears in after-action summaries, but rarely in popular histories, understood the situation immediately. 2 men were injured during a nearby artillery barrage, not gravely, but seriously enough that exposure and infection could become fatal. Ammunition was low. Rations were stretched thin. Without communication, the platoon could not coordinate a withdrawal or request evacuation. The officer faced a dilemma familiar to many commanders in Italy: hold position and risk collapse, or attempt a movement that terrain itself seemed to forbid. It was then that the unit's attached pack horse became central to every calculation. Trained for endurance rather than speed, the horse had already carried supplies along narrow trails that men struggled to walk. Army manuals from the period document how such animals were adapted for casualty evacuation using improvised harnesses and sled-like supports. The horse did not panic under noise or uneven ground. In conditions where machinery failed, it moved with steady certainty. The decision was made to use the horse to evacuate the wounded and restore communication with rear units. It was not a dramatic decision, but a calculated one rooted in necessity. Each trip would take hours. Each descent down the mountain would expose both handlers and animal to cold, fatigue, and enemy observation. Yet there was no alternative left that did not guarantee loss. As preparations began, morale within the platoon shifted subtly. The men understood what was at stake. Survival no longer depended on firepower or orders from above, but on whether this single, ancient method of transport could succeed under modern war's pressure. Snow continued to fall. Darkness closed in early, and beside the silent line of soldiers, the horse stood calmly, waiting, unaware that the fate of an entire platoon was about to hinge on its next steps. By dawn the next morning, the platoon situation had not improved. Snow continued to fall, softening the sounds of the mountains but worsening every practical problem. Cold crept into gloves, boots, and bandages. The injured men were stable for the moment. Yet the medic knew that time worked against them. Infection and exposure did not announce themselves loudly. They arrived quietly, hours later, when options were gone. The platoon commander studied the terrain again, comparing maps to what stood before him. The charts were outdated, drawn before shelling and winter had reshaped the mountains. Radio silence confirmed what he already suspected. Command had no idea how isolated they were. Waiting carried its own risk. Holding position without resupply could turn a manageable situation into disaster. The decision would have to be made locally, without permission. Attention returned to the pack horse tethered nearby, steam rising from its breath in the cold air. The animal had already proven reliable. Hauling food and ammunition up slopes, no vehicle could touch. Army field manuals described horses as logistical assets. But here, theory met consequence. Using the horse for evacuation meant committing to a slow, exposed route down the mountain, one that could not be rushed or repeated endlessly. The medic outlined the reality with careful words. 1 wounded man could be moved at a time, secured with improvised supports documented in mountain warfare guidelines. Each trip would take hours. Escorts would rotate to avoid exhaustion. If weather worsened, the descent could become impossible, yet leaving the wounded where they were carried an even greater risk. The choice was not between safety and danger, but between danger and certainty. For the soldiers listening, the weight of responsibility settled heavily. No one spoke of heroism. They spoke of logistics, timing, and restraint. The horse remained calm, shifting its weight as if sensing preparation rather than fear. Its presence introduced a strange stability into the discussion. In a campaign defined by unpredictability, the animal represented something dependable, an element that had not yet failed them. Orders were given quietly. The first evacuation would begin immediately, before weather or patrol movement could complicate the route. The men prepared without ceremony, tightening straps and checking knots with gloved hands. No one knew how many trips would be required, or how long the mountain would allow them to continue. What they understood was simpler and more urgent. Without this decision, the platoon's margin for survival would vanish. As the horse was led toward the narrow trail descending into fog and snow, the platoon watched in silence. This was no longer a supporting asset. It was the plan itself, and with the first careful steps downhill, the outcome of the entire position began to move slowly, deliberately out of the mountains. The first descent began just after mid-morning, when the light was still strong enough to read the terrain but weak enough to hide movement from distant observation. The wounded soldier was secured carefully to the improvised harness, following procedures outlined in mountain warfare manuals used by Allied units in Italy. Every strap was checked twice. A mistake here would not be forgiven by the slope, the cold, or gravity itself. The horse stood still throughout, breathing slowly, as if aware that sudden movement would endanger everyone involved. The trail downward was narrower than expected. Snow hid loose stone, and ice glazed the rock beneath. Two soldiers walked ahead, clearing footing where they could. Another followed behind, watching the harness and the wounded man's condition. The horse moved deliberately, placing each hoof with care. Unlike the men, it did not rush when footing slipped. Its pace forced discipline on everyone else. Speed was replaced by control, and control became survival. Halfway down, visibility dropped sharply. Fog rolled through the mountain pass, erasing depth and distance. Sounds carried strangeness, sometimes close, sometimes far away. The escort froze more than once, listening for a movement that might indicate patrols or shifting terrain. No shots were fired. No enemies appeared, yet the tension never eased. In this environment, discovery was not loud. It was soothing. The wounded man remained conscious, gripping the side supports with numb hands. The medic had warned that shock could worsen during movement. Periodic stops were made, not to rest, but to check signs that could not be ignored. The horse waited patiently during each pause, head lowered, unmoving. Soldiers later recalled how its calm steadiness countered their own fear. Machines failed here. The animal did not. By late afternoon, they reached the lower supply route, still damaged, but passable. Communication was restored briefly through a rear unit operating from a sheltered valley position. The message sent was simple and urgent. Wounded evacuated, platoon isolated, animal transport essential. There was no guarantee of immediate response, but the connection itself mattered. Isolation had been broken, if only narrowly. The horse was not allowed to rest long. The trail back up would be harder. Snow had begun again, heavier than before. The escort rotated, conserving strength where possible. No one spoke about how many trips remained. Counting would not help. The mountain would decide that. As the horse turned back toward the ascent, the platoon above waited, watching the narrow path disappear into fog. One evacuation had succeeded. That fact alone changed everything. It meant the system worked. It meant survival was possible. But it also raised a harder question: how many more times? Could this descent be repeated before weather? By the time the horse completed its first return climb, daylight was already fading. Snow thickened the air, dulling sound and shortening visibility. The platoon commander counted heads as the escort rejoined the position. One man was going to evacuate at Siflibov. The situation remained fragile. Ammunition was still low. Rations were still measured carefully, and now every decision depended on whether the mountain would allow the horse to keep moving. Reports from rear units arrived slowly and without certainty. Supplies could be staged at the valley route, but no vehicles would attempt the climb. Weather forecasts offered little comfort. The responsibility of sustaining the position rested entirely on local judgment. The commander understood that the horse was no longer supporting the platoon, it was enabling the platoon's existence. Without it, Holding the line would become impossible within days. The second evacuation was planned under stricter limits. Time on the trail would be reduced. Escorts would rotate more aggressively. If conditions deteriorated further, the mission would be aborted immediately. These were not theoretical rules. Mountain warfare manuals stressed restraint as much as action, warning that persistence without judgment often caused more losses than enemy fire. The platoon medic supported the plan, emphasizing that unnecessary movement could worsen outcomes rather than improve them. As preparations resumed, the soldiers' internal conflict became visible. No one wanted to rely on an animal for survival, yet no one questioned its effectiveness anymore. The horse had earned trust without ceremony. Men spoke to it softly, while tightening straps, not out of sentiment, but concentration. Familiar routines calmed nerves when nothing else could. In war, repetition often replaced confidence. The second descents began under heavier snowfall. Tracks from the earlier trip were already fading in a Sedby wind. The horse moved cautiously, adjusting pace to the changing ground. Several times, the escort stopped entirely, waiting for gusts to pass before continuing. This was not Ferret's calculation. Survival depended on reading the mountain correctly, not challenging it. Hours later, confirmation arrived that additional supplies had been secured below. The message reached the platoon just before nightfall. It did not promise rescue, but it confirmed continuity. Ammunition, food, and medical materials would be moved upward in stages, as long as the horse could climb. The system had reversed. Evacuation was no longer the only goal. Sustenance had become equally critical. As darkness settled over the position, the platoon reorganized quietly. Weapons were checked, watches were set. The horse stood nearby, covered against the cold, resting before the next descent. No one spoke about how long this could continue. The question was understood without words. The mountain had not closed its path yet, but each successful movement narrowed the margin, and somewhere between exhaustion and resolve, the platoon waited, knowing that survival now moved one careful step at a time. As the days passed, the snow deepened, and the mountain became even less hospitable. The platoon had already exceeded its expected time-holding position. The first evacuation was successful, and supplies were trickling in slowly but steadily. Yet the situation remained precarious. The Allied advance was still miles away, and the weather showed no sign of relenting. The horse, once a simple tool for transport, now symbolized both the platoon's reliance on tradition and its fight against the relentless force of nature. Every trip to bring supplies up from the valley became harder. The snow made footing treacherous, and the cold gnawed at their bones, sapping their strength. The men rotated constantly to avoid exhaustion, but fatigue remained the ever-present shadow. The horse moved steadily, as it always had, but the pace was slower, its steps more labored. The couriers, equally burdened, carefully managed their energy, knowing that one misstep could lead to a fall, a delayed delivery, or worse, a broken leg on the icy trail. The second evacuation came later than anticipated. The time between the previous journey and this one felt longer than it was, marked by cold days and longer nights. Every moment outside the relative warmth of the shelter felt like a battle against the mountain itself. When the platoon medic confirmed the condition of the second wounded man, a quiet sense of urgency gripped the unit. There was no room left for error. The horse and the men who depended on it knew this journey could not afford the slightest delay. This time, the terrain was far more unforgiving. By the time the horse and its riders reached the midway point, it was clear that the route was becoming unsustainable. What had been a reliable passage was now nearly impassable, with the path buried under fresh snow. The decision to continue was not made lightly. The men knew that if they turned back, the wounded would be lost. They had no choice but to push forward. Each step forward was a calculation. The soldiers did not speak much, letting the rhythm of the journey dictate the pace. The risk was palpable, but there was no other option. As they descended further into the valley, the horse's steady gait provided a strange comfort. It was not faster, but it moved without faltering, a consistent rhythm amid the uncertainty. The soldiers, moving in silent formation behind it, understood the magnitude of their task. They were not simply delivering supplies. They were maintaining the link between survival and desperation, between hope and defeat. By the time the final delivery was made and the wounded soldier was safely evacuated, but there was a quiet sense of accomplishment. Against the odds, they had managed to hold their ground. The horse's unwavering persistence had kept them connected to the larger fight, even when the odds were stacked against them. And as the cold night settled in, the platoon realized that, in this war, survival often meant relying on the simplest methods, the ones that seemed least likely by the sixth day in the mountains. The platoon understood that endurance itself had become their primary strategy. No decisive movement was coming. No sudden relief. The Allied advance below them was slow, constrained by terrain and weather. What had begun as a temporary hold had evolved into a prolonged test of discipline, patience, and restraint. Every action now was weighed not only against enemy threat, but against exhaustion and exposure. The horse showed signs of strain that no one could ignore. Its movements remained controlled, but recovery between trips took longer. Handlers adjusted feeding schedules and reduced unnecessary loads, following guidance from Army veterinary manuals used during the Italian campaign. These animals were not expendable assets. They were managed carefully because losing one could collapse an entire logistical chain. The platoon treated the horse accordingly, understanding that its well-being directly affected their own chances. Supplies continued to arrive in limited quantities. Ammunition was rationed precisely. Food was distributed evenly, with no expectation of surplus. The commander emphasized conservation rather than confrontation. Patrols were avoided unless necessary. Silence was maintained as much as possible. The goal was no longer to hold ground aggressively, but to remain intact long enough for conditions to change. In this phase of war, survival and success were no longer separate outcomes. Morale fluctuated with the weather. Clear hours brought cautious optimism. Storms tightened nerves. Soldiers wrote brief notes when they could. Later found among personal effects observations about cold, waiting, and the strange comfort of routine. Several mentioned the horse specifically, not with sentiment, but with respect. It was described as steady, predictable, and reliable. In an environment defined by uncertainty, those qualities mattered more than bravery. Another evacuation was considered, but ultimately postponed. The medic advised that movement would increase risk more than benefit under current conditions. This decision reflected a broader shift in thinking. Earlier, action had been the solution. Now, restraint was. The horse remained tethered nearby, rested and ready, but unused. That readiness alone carried weight. Knowing the option existed preserved morale, even when it could not be exercised. Communication with rear units improved slightly as weather shifted. Messages confirmed that relief forces were progressing, slowly. The platoon was advised to maintain position if possible, withdraw only if conditions became untenable. The commander shared this information selectively, balancing transparency with stability. Hope needed to be grounded, not inflated. As night fell again over the mountains, the platoon settled into watch rotations, shaped by necessity rather than doctrine. Weapons were maintained quietly. The horse was covered and sheltered as best as conditions allowed. There were no speeches, no dramatic gestures. The strategy was simple now. Endure without breaking. And in that strategy, the horse remained central not because it was moving, but because it made movement possible when nothing else could. The change came quietly, almost unnoticed at first. On the morning of the seventh day, the wind shifted direction, carrying sounds the platoon had not heard since arriving in the mountains. Distant engines, not close enough to promise immediate relief, but near enough to confirm movement below. For men who had lived inside silence and snow, that sound altered everything. It did not mean safety yet, but it meant time was finally working with them instead of against them. The platoon commander gathered his section leaders and shared what little confirmation had arrived overnight. Allied units were pushing forward through the valley, clearing resistance slowly but steadily. The order was cautious. Maintain position if conditions allowed, prepare for extraction if routes opened. There was no timetable. In Italy, operations rarely followed clean schedules. Still, the knowledge that they were no longer forgotten changed the atmosphere immediately. Attention returned to the horsenet as a last resort, but as a bridge between. If the trail reopened even partially, it would be used to move final supplies and coordinate contact. Handlers checked its condition carefully. Though tired, the animal remained sound. Arma veterinary notes later emphasized that endurance animals often appeared more resilient than exhausted soldiers because their pace never exceeded safe limits. The horse had never been rushed. That discipline now paid dividends. Weather offered a narrow window. Snowfall slowed, and fog lifted briefly along the ridgeline. The commander authorized one final movement, not evacuation, but communication. A short descent would confirm whether the lower route was passable for relief elements. It was a calculated risk, smaller than earlier ones, but still essential. The horse was loaded lightly. Escorted by a reduced team to minimize exposure and fatigue, the descent proceeded without incident. The trail, while damaged, remained usable. Signs of Allied presence were visible: discarded equipment, fresh tracks, and cleared obstructions. Contact was made with forward elements moving uphill. The message returned was simple and decisive. Relief was coming, not immediately, but soon enough to matter. The escort turned back without delay, preserving the path for what would follow. When the horse returned to the platoon's position, the change was visible. Men stood taller. Movements became purposeful rather than cautious. Preparations shifted from conservation to transition. Equipment was reorganized. Wounded were reassessed for movement. The mountain, which had dictated every decision for days, was finally loosening its hold. That night, for the first time since isolation began, the platoon slept in shifts, shaped by anticipation rather than fear. The horse stood nearby, resting, no longer burdened, but still essential. Its role was nearly complete, not because it had carried them out, but because it had kept them intact long enough for help to arrive. As dawn approached, the men understood something that would stay with them long after the campaign ended. Survival had not depended on speed, strength, or firepower. It had depended on patience, restraint, and one steady solution that refused to fail. The mountain had tested them. They had endured, and without the quiet reliability of that horse, endurance would never have been an option at all. The 8th day began with a silence that felt different from the ones before it. It was no longer the heavy stillness of isolation, but a pause filled with expectation. From the ridgeline, the platoon could now see faint movement in the valley below Calems, advancing slowly, carefully, shaped by the same terrain that had trapped them. Relief was no longer theoretical. It was becoming physical, measured in distance rather than hope. The platoon commander adjusted plans immediately. The objective was no longer endurance alone, but transition. The position would be held just long enough to coordinate a safe withdrawal once contact was established. Discipline remained critical. A premature movement could still result in loss. The mountain had not become forgiving. It had merely become negotiable. Every order reflected that balance. Once again, attention turned to the horse. It was prepared for a different kind of task, now not emergency evacuation or desperate resupply, but coordination. Light loads were secured, including written confirmations and route markings prepared according to standard Allied procedures. These details mattered. As units converged, clarity prevented confusion, and confusion in mountains could still prove fatal. The horse descended with an escort under clearer skies than they had seen in days. The trail bore signs of change: cleared snow, fresh footprints, and discarded enemy material abandoned during withdrawal. When contact was made with advancing Allied elements, the exchange was brief and professional. Positions were confirmed, timelines adjusted. The platoon's isolation was officially over. The return ascent felt lighter, though no less careful. When the horse emerged back into the platoon's position, the response was immediate and unmistakable. Men gathered quietly, listening as confirmation was passed down the line. Relief would arrive within hours. Weather permitting, the long wait had not been wasted. The position had held, the wounded had survived. The chain had not broken. Preparations for withdrawal began methodically. Equipment was consolidated. Routes were marked. The horse was rested and watered, no longer required to move under strain. Its role shifted once more from lifeline to assurance. Knowing it was still available allowed commanders to plan without desperation. That alone reduced risk. As the platoon prepared to move at first light, the mountain seemed less oppressive, though unchanged. The cold remained. The snow remained. What had changed was the outcome. Survival was no longer a question, but a process nearing completion. And in that process, the horse's contribution was unmistakable, not dramatic, not celebrated, but decisive. That night, as watches rotated and final preparations were made, one realization settled quietly among the men. If relief had been delayed even one more day, the margin would have closed. Endurance had limits. The horse had stretched those limits just far enough. Without it, the platoon would not have reached this moment, not intact and not together. Relief arrived just after first light, not with dramatic fanfare, but with quiet precision. Allied infantry units advanced carefully along the same routes the horse had traveled repeatedly, now widened just enough to allow men to pass safely. Contact was confirmed with hand signals and brief exchanges. No one lingered. The mountain still demanded respect. The platoon's isolation had ended, but extraction required discipline equal to endurance. The platoon commander coordinated the withdrawal in stages, ensuring that no equipment or wounded were left behind. The decision to delay movement until full confirmation now proved correct. Routes were stable enough to support controlled descent, though still unforgiving. Soldiers moved deliberately, spacing maintained eyes on footing rather than horizon. The horse walked among them, unloaded and calm, no longer a lifeline but a companion to survival. As they descended, the landscape revealed signs of rapid change. Enemy positions had been abandoned in haste. Supply caches lay unused. The pressure that had once trapped the platoon was receding, replaced by movement and momentum. For the men, this shift felt surreal. Days earlier, every decision had carried the weight of finality. Now, the future extended beyond the ridge. Medical personnel met the platoon at a secured position below. Wounded men were transferred without urgency for the first time since isolation began. Records later noted that early evacuation and sustained support had prevented serious complications. These reports made no mention of the horse. They did not need to. The chain of survival was understood by those who had lived it. The horse was handed over briefly to logistics handlers, examined, fed, and cleared for further service. Army veterinary notes described it as fatigued but healthy and expected condition after sustained operations. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement beyond procedure. Yet several soldiers later recalled that moment distinctly. It marked the transition from survival to continuity. As the platoon rejoined the larger formation, debriefings began immediately. Maps were updated, routes marked. Commanders took note of how isolation had been sustained without vehicle access or radio contact. The use of pack animals was logged as effective under extreme terrain constraints, language that understated what had truly occurred. Doctrine rarely captured experience fully. Those who had endured knew the difference. That evening, as the men rested under shelter for the first time in days, conversation returned slowly, not about combat or recognition, but about waiting, cold, and the strange clarity that comes when options disappear. Several mentioned the horse sentimentally, but without it, none of the preceding days would have unfolded the same way. The mountain had released them, but it had also left its mark. Endurance had proven possible, but only Hoost, as the platoon prepared to move forward again with the campaign. One understanding remained clear among them all. Survival had not been guaranteed by strength or speed. It had been preserved by one steady solution that refused to break under pressure, and that understanding would follow them long after the war moved on. In the weeks that followed their extraction from the mountains, the platoon returned to active operations as part of the broader Allied advance in Italy. Their ordeal was recorded in brief after-action reports, reduced to coordinates, weather notes, and logistical remarks. There was no special designation for what they had endured, no dramatic language to describe isolation measured in days and decisions measured in restraint. On paper, it appeared routine. In reality, it had been anything but. Military analysts, later reviewing the Italian campaign, would note how terrain, not enemy strength, dictated outcomes across large sections of the front. Units that survived prolonged isolation did so not because of superior firepower, but because commanders adapted methods to conditions rather than doctrine. The platoon's survival fit this pattern precisely. Their success was rooted in accepting limits of machines of communication, of endurance and working within them instead of against them. The horse that had sustained their connection to the rear remained in service for some time after. Records list it simply as part of a pack section, rotated as needed, maintained according to veterinary standards of the period. No individual mention appeared in commendations or unit histories. This absence was intentional, not neglectful. The system was designed to function without spotlight. Recognition, in such cases, would have been irrelevant to purpose. For the men of the platoon, memory operated differently than record. Years later, some spoke about the mountain in letters, interviews, or quiet conversations. They remembered waiting more than fighting, silence more than noise, and they remembered the steady presence that made waiting possible. Not as a symbol, but as a fact. Without that horse, movement would have stopped. And if movement had stopped, survival would have followed. The lesson carried forward quietly. Future mountain operations continued to rely on pack animals long after more advanced technology existed. Manuals were updated. Training emphasized adaptability. The Italian campaign reinforced a truth armies had learned repeatedly across centuries. Progress does not erase fundamentals, it only changes how they are applied. In this case, survival depended on remembering something old when something new failed. As the war moved toward its conclusion, the platoon dispersed, reassigned, promoted, wounded, or returned home. The mountain became a story told less often with time, yet its meaning endured. Not as a tale of heroics, but as proof that war is shaped as much by patience and logistics as by courage. That distinction mattered to those who lived it. The title of this story is not metaphorical. Without that horse, the platoon would not have been lost suddenly or dramatically. They would have faded through, injury untreated, supplies exhausted, decisions narrowed to nothing. Survival arrived instead through steadiness, one careful step at a time. In the end, that is why they survived. Not because of force, not because of luck, but because one solution endured when everything else failed. And in the quiet history of World War II, that kind of endurance mattered more than anyone ever wrote down.